feel a bit lost when you're looking to choose a saddle fitter? I know a lot of you, well, some of you will be my customers, but those of you who aren't, I hope that a discussion on choosing and working with a saddle fitter might be quite useful. The industry is a really interesting one. I've been in it 15 years now, and I think if I'd have known exactly what the industry was like, I might have thought longer and harder about it. But it was so much more attractive to me than the office job I had, and I am glad I do it. I'm really glad I do it, but it's not easy, and we do get trashed. As I'm sure you all know, you will see it that, saddle fitters get a bit of a kicking, and there's a lot of frustration out there. So I wrote a blog post maybe a month ago on why can't saddle fitters agree? And I used to talk about an analogy with surgeons that if your GP recommended you onto a particular surgeon and you had a chat with them and they came up with their prognosis, their diagnosis, their prognosis. Your diagnosis is probably already done, but their prognosis is going to reflect a lot of things, including, I'm trying to think, if you were doing a hip replacement, if you were having a hip replacement, there may well be different prosthetics, is that the right word? The actual hip replacement part. And if they were quite different, you wouldn't expect that, say if you went to two surgeons for recommendations, so a second opinion, if they were recommending a different type of hip replacement component because they believed it was better, you wouldn't be surprised that the protocols, the procedures were going to be slightly different, and that your rest time might be different, your outcome might be different. Now, medicine's pretty scientific. In saddle fitting, well, we're sort of getting a bit more scientific, but I don't always feel that a lot of the application of science is particularly helpful in the real world. That's a whole different topic. But if two surgeons can't agree about how to do an operation on a human being, then this complex job, not to say surgery isn't complex, but trying to provide an interface of a fairly rigid object between two moving objects, one of whom can't express his opinion, one of whom can, or rather the first can't vocalize their opinion, can't give you vocal feedback. It is a tricky job, and I can see why this frustration wells up, and people blame the saddle fitter for things that potentially could be the saddle fitter's fault. There are certainly saddle fitters out there that I think are working to some really poor protocols, some really poor paradigms, i.e. best ideas and what we're aiming for in our own heads, poor paradigms of saddle fit. So I'm hoping that going through some of this is going to really help people. So I've made a few notes because it is quite a complex kind of topic, and I will be doing, I think, how many have I decided on? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, possibly 5 blog posts to follow. I don't put them up that often, so it'll take me a little while, but they're only sketched out at the moment. I'll talk first today about searching for a saddle fitter. And then I think the blog post will go into more detail on particular aspects of the industry and different fitters and the way they work. So I would encourage everybody to go to my blog. It's stephaniebloomsaddlefitter.co.uk, and I will post a link to the blog in the comments or possibly in the commentary. So have a read through of that, and it will start you realising why it just isn't a thing that saddle fitters can all come in and have exactly the same opinion on the saddle that you have fitted, and it's why you might get recommended something else when the saddle that you've got actually fits in the opinion of someone else, and that someone else can make it fit, can adjust it, no problem. So searching for a saddle fitter, the first thing I would want you to think about is your immediate need is for a saddle, probably, or possibly for a saddle check. And that's the need that you have, that you want that box ticked, and you'd like somebody to come out and check your saddle, or you'd like them to sell you a new saddle. Now, obviously, looking into a new saddle, you've got an extra component, or you think you might have, which is the brands that they stock, and I will get into that in another post. But in some ways, if all saddle fitters approach things differently, if all saddles are designed differently, even if they seem very similar, like most English Benchmade saddles, then if the saddles they stock are different, then they're going to have a slightly different paradigm on saddle fit. So often as not, you are better finding somebody that does work with the brand, is a specialist, is trained by the company. Again, we'll get into that in another blog. So yes, if you're searching for a saddle fitter, your immediate need is the saddle fitting. But actually, the more that we go forwards, the more I think we're realizing that we've lost a lot of that innate knowledge that we had in horse ownership about what your horse needs, understanding what a good hoof should look like, understanding what good biomechanics, good posture looks like, about where the rider should be sat, about pros and cons of different training approaches, about the validity of what we see in the show ring and whether that's the best of what's out there. So we've kind of lost some of that, and we're being swayed by what we see around us, and social media means we see a lot of stuff. So we're maybe being led astray a little bit. So I think we need to look, instead of at just getting somebody in to fit you a saddle or check you a saddle, you need somebody you can work with long term, who is going to help you with your understanding of saddle fit in their terms, the way that they fit saddles, and to that end what you might need to look for to check that your saddle is still okay and doesn't need the saddle fitter to come out. But the relationship also feeds into the teams that in an ideal world we would all be working with. It's probably too costly for everybody to actually work together, though there are some successful clinics where you get multiple practitioners. You get a saddle fitter, you get a bridle and bit fitter, you get a bodyworker, a trainer, maybe a vet farrier, and where you've got a horse that's not quite right, or it's been through everything with the vet and you cannot find what's wrong, then they can be really useful. But otherwise you're talking more informal arrangement where you know your professionals can talk to each other. Now, do appreciate it if your professionals do this, because it can take quite a lot of time talking to other professionals, talking to other members of your team about how to move forwards, how to keep your horse healthy, how to prevent long-term lameness issues. So your saddle fitters should be out with you at least twice a year for saddle checks. They might be answering questions, they might be doing remote checks in between. They should be fitting with an eye to how you're sitting, to how your horse's posture is, to how they're moving. And so it really should be a long-term relationship. So that's the first thing to think of, is can you work with this person long-term? Do they answer your questions? All of that kind of stuff. And again, I'll get into a little bit more detail about how to do your searching, your research, as we go on through this series. But what you do need to work out is what is important to you. When there are so many different saddle fitters out there with different approaches, with different brands, with different protocols, with different paradigms, all the stuff we've talked about, then you need to be very clear about what you need. Somebody who goes online, and we see it all the time, goes online and says, I'm in, we'll say Suffolk, that's where I am, I need a saddle fitter. Who do you recommend? And, well, that's fine, but if you haven't said what you want a saddle fitter for, that's one of your basic what's important to you. Like I say, maybe they should be working with the brand that you already own if it's a saddle check. But we really need to look at your kind of situation and what you want from the fitter. So what's your current situation? Does your horse have a really complex history? Do you need somebody who's experienced with rehab? Do you need somebody who looks at biomechanics? Who gets into the detail of horse saddle rider, like I do. I am very holistic. I look right across the board. So you may want somebody along those lines. I would certainly recommend it when we look at this kind of long-term relationship thing, is somebody that understands posture, compensatory movement patterns. I think is really important. But the more complicated the fit for your horse, the more complex his history, her history, then the more important that might be. You can't just sit there and say, well, what's important to me is having a saddle that fits me okay, fits my horse really well. That's all that matters. I understand that, but everybody wants that. So you need to come up with your personal list of what's important to you. The industry somewhat presents it as there will be one solution, and so you just need your recommended or qualified or whatever saddle fitter to come out. They will work from that one perfect paradigm. They will find you the saddle that works for both of you, but it just isn't that simple. You'd be cutting out an awful lot of options if you do that, but equally you need to hone in. So I'm going to run through a few things that you need to consider that might be important to you when choosing a saddle fitter. So how complex are the pair of you to fit? Are there any specialisms required? And that might be, white horse specialist or remedial horse specialist, a biomechanical understanding, that holistic view. Beyond that, we're then looking at what's your budget? Because even if you're having somebody out to check a saddle, costs can vary. Obviously, if somebody's coming from further away, we would expect their call out to be higher. Their travel costs are going to be higher. Somebody that allows more time for the fitting, which I think is important, is going to cost more. But you're going to get more information on your visit. You're going to get a more thorough assessment and assessment of you riding in the saddle after it's been adjusted and so on. So cost, be very careful, spend as much as you can afford, and get the saddle fitter that can spend the longest with you, because that's going to give you the better outcome, in my opinion. What have I put? Speed. How soon they can get out to you. That will partly depend on how local they are to you, because if they're covering a really big area, their trips to your area may be less often. If you have a remedial horse that's going to need really regular checks, then if the saddle fitter isn't local to you, doesn't have rapid availability, then perhaps look at somebody that can offer remote saddle checks in between. They are not a straight replacement for an in-person visit, but as part of an ongoing process of regular checks, it can be incredibly useful. And it is cheaper, so we're going back to cost there. But many saddle fitters, however they're set up, are not going to be able to fit you in at short notice very often. It's just the way it is. If something goes wrong with your saddle, I always recommend everybody be able to work their horse in hand, without a saddle to an extent, because there may be periods where you don't have a saddle available to you, not one that fits. So it does depend then how they do their diary. Even people that travel long distance, some of them will book you in and then try and build a trip around the date that you can do. But I travel much further, so mine's completely different. Mine is, I wait for enough that I can book in an area. Then, how much choice are they going to offer? This would really be in terms of a new saddle. Do you want tons of choice for the sake of it? Because sometimes it is for the sake of it. If somebody's got 12, 15 brands, certainly any more than 5, possibly 10, how much can they really know about those saddles? How much do they understand the trees? How much do they understand the protocols behind them? Have they been trained in all those brands? And there's the really detailed focus way that each of those brands should be fitted, because certainly my 2 brands are fitted completely differently. And, can you come out with a van full of saddles? I've always had a small van. I stuff it full of saddles, but I have saddles that are going to fit, whether it's wider shapes or whether it's going to be the Ergo X2, from the approach of what do we need to bring horse, saddle and rider together in the most optimum way. I've got lots of demos for those. But a van full of saddles, if there's 200 saddles and none of them fit your treble extra wide short-backed cob, then it's pointless, isn't it, having 200 saddles in the back of a van. And then really you need to think about what's important to you as your commitment as an owner. We've talked about the cost, that is your commitment to pay for the service, but also how much do you want to get involved. Now, personally, I like my owners to be involved as possible, is to learn as much as possible, to understand how their saddle fits and why, to realise their role. They're the only person that sees the horse every day. You're the only person that sees the horse every day. And it does become ultimately your responsibility to spot changes. And if you can't spot those changes, you're going to need more regular visits. So if you're more interactive, if you learn as much as possible, if you take responsibility in terms of keeping their weight the same, building their muscle, keeping their posture, their movement patterns correct, then you'll need a different type of fitter than if you want to, I'm not going to say just hack, because it would be a really unfair sort of thing to say that it only goes with happy hackers, but maybe you're somebody who just wants the saddle sorted and you don't want to have to think about it. Now, I'll argue that from my point of view, that's just not fair. Saddle fitters can't swoop in twice a year and make everything perfect, even 4 times a year, make everything perfect, without that two-way kind of conversation, participation, that you maybe do groundwork when it's needed. You don't ride when the saddle doesn't fit. You seek to make changes with hoof care, with maybe your management routines of the horse. There are so many things that your saddle fitter might say are having an impact on the fit of the saddle, and it's too easy to brush off the saddle fitter and go, oh, for God's sake, they're overstepping. You know, the saddle fitter should stay in their lane. So have a really good think about how you feel about all of that. What is important to you? Because until you know what's important to you, you're on a crapshoot with hunting for a saddle fitter. If you ask for recommendations, 2 things. If you're asking people for recommendations, put in your post what you need and why, for the reasons I've just explained, but also then ask people, why would you recommend them? What was it about them? Not just a whole load of names, because you got no further information as to would they be any good for you. They might have been good for that person, but for you. So definitely put that up, but also don't rely on those kind of posts. People who want to leave reviews about really bad experiences they've had, or really good experiences they've had, probably won't see your post. So I would go really hunting and look for reviews, go onto Horse and Hound, go back on Facebook, search, find out how to search on all of these platforms. So I hope that has been vaguely helpful. That's kind of an introduction, just to pull in all the posts I'm going to be doing over the next few weeks or possibly months, depending on how quickly I get on with them. And happy to answer any questions. Watch out for the blogs. Again, there will be a link to my blog in this post. Yeah, I will welcome any questions. And good luck with choosing yourself a saddle fitter who suits you and your horse.